When I first heard Stephen Kotkin say, "The horror of the Ukraine war delivered a bounty to us on China policy," I had to stop and play it again. It sounded too sharp, almost brutal, as if he was squeezing strategic meaning out of something that should only be described as tragedy. But Kotkin isn't glorifying anything. He's describing a structural truth about how the international system behaves when it's under stress. Sometimes one disaster ripples outward and rearranges the balance of power far beyond its original borders. And the moment he said that, I realized he wasn't talking about the war itself. He was talking about what the war exposed, what it accelerated, and what it changed for everyone watching China's rise. That's what I'm going to explain here, why Kotkin sees this conflict as a geopolitical turning point, and why that sentence deserves more attention than the shock it produces on first hearing. Most people in the US talk about Ukraine as a fight over budgets, as if the entire story is measured in dollar signs and political speeches. Kotkin looks at it from a completely different vantage point. He sees alliances shifting, national instincts resurfacing, and the world's two largest authoritarian powers unintentionally rewriting their own strategic position. When he says Ukraine isn't just a cost, he means it. He argues that the money the US spends is not disappearing into a black hole, it's reshaping the environment America will have to operate in for decades. That's why he insists what some people are calling expenditure is actually an investment in our prosperity and security. He's not dressing up a bill. He's reframing the entire balance sheet. For years, China had a relatively simple but effective approach to Europe. They didn't need Europe to side with them. They just needed Europe not to fully side with America. As long as European governments stayed cautious, pragmatic, and commercially entangled with Beijing, China had strategic space. And for a long time, that worked. Europeans loved stability. They wanted business opportunities, not ideological confrontation. Washington pointed at human rights abuses and maritime aggression, but Europe mostly shrugged and signed trade deals. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, and China chose to align, politically and rhetorically, with Moscow. Suddenly Europe saw China not as a distant business partner, but as a power willing to stand beside a regime launching a full-scale war on the continent. This wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't about values written in policy papers. It was a matter of physical security. And that changed everything. Kotkin captured that shift in a single line. Maybe this is a wake-up call. Europe's denial evaporated almost overnight. Countries that had resisted calling China a systemic threat began rethinking their entire approach. Supply chains, technology, energy, defense posture, everything was suddenly on the table. Japan, which had already been watching China with a wary eye, accelerated its own strategic transformation. Even the United States, long frustrated with Europe's hesitation, found itself with something it had struggled to build for years, a unified democratic coalition that now saw China with the same clarity Washington had been trying to articulate. And that's the bounty Kotkin meant. Not a prize, but a realignment. Not something anyone wanted, but something that now exists and will shape how the US confronts China's rise. Once you understand that, the entire story of Ukraine becomes part of something larger, a global contest unfolding across alliances, economies, and the fragile architecture of the 21st century. To understand why this realignment matters, you have to look at what actually unfolded inside Ukraine after those first chaotic weeks. Because Kotkin's point isn't that Ukraine won or is winning. It's that the war revealed the limits and illusions surrounding power in the 21st century. He puts it bluntly with one of his most unsettling lines. Russia is destroying their house. And he's right. The images of a liberated Kiev don't tell the whole story. Behind them is a country whose infrastructure, cities, and economic future have been under relentless assault. Even as Ukraine resists with remarkable courage, the simple fact is that both sides have endured a war designed to grind, not to conquer quickly. This is not a contest of territory alone. It is a battle of endurance, production capacity, and political will. Kotkin often talks about war not as a collection of battles, but as an industrial and psychological competition. Russia miscalculated wildly, but it also adapted. It shifted to a wartime economy, built new supply lines, and accepted levels of loss that would be politically impossible in democratic societies. Ukraine, meanwhile, depends on outside support, not because it lacks the will to fight, but because modern warfare is brutally expensive. The drones, artillery shells, air defenses, none of that appears out of thin air. And this is where Kotkin turns his attention to the United States. He warns that America is fighting with constraints it imposed on itself, relying on old stockpiles instead of expanding capacity. He argues that the US must understand the long game. Industrial power is strategic power, and wars of attrition expose nations that rely on warehouses instead of production lines. But Kotkin's analysis doesn't stop in Eastern Europe. He uses the war to illuminate something bigger, how states misunderstand the nature of control. That idea becomes sharper when he talks about Taiwan. When he says, "If you take it, you can't have it," he's describing a fundamental contradiction in conquest. The moment force is used to seize a modern, technologically advanced society, the very qualities that make it valuable are destroyed. Factories stop, talent flees, investment evaporates. The global market collapses around it. You might own the territory, but you've obliterated the reasons you wanted it in the first place. Kotkin wants people to see that power today isn't measured by how much land a country can seize, but by how much cooperation it can generate. And this is exactly why he believes a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be an act of desperation, not confidence, because Beijing understands that the cost of winning by force is losing everything afterward. There's also another layer to his argument. No one truly knows what Xi Jinping is thinking. Analysts speak with absolute certainty about red lines and timelines, but Kotkin pushes back against that overconfidence. He jokes, critiques, and then lands on a deeper point. Authoritarian systems hide their internal logic even from themselves. Decisions are shaped by fear, ambition, and political survival, not by clean strategic formulas. And if that's true, then the greatest danger isn't rational calculation, it's miscalculation amplified by secrecy. When Kotkin stitches all of this together, Ukraine's endurance, Russia's missteps, America's constraints, China's dilemmas, he isn't just analyzing events. He's tracing the architecture of a world where mistakes cascade across continents. A world where wars don't stay in their lanes, where one region's tragedy becomes another region's turning point, and where the real contest is not for territory, but for the systems that allow societies to thrive or collapse. When Kotkin shifts from the battlefield to what he calls the strategic horizon, the entire conversation deepens. Because at some point, the question stops being whether Ukraine can push Russian forces back another 10 miles and becomes something much bigger. What does winning even mean? And Kotkin's answer is not the one people expect. He argues that the true path to victory doesn't run through retaking every inch of occupied territory. It runs through Ukraine, transforming itself into a prosperous, integrated democracy anchored to the West. In his words, the game here is EU accession. And when you think about that, the whole picture changes. Suddenly, the war stops being a territorial dispute and becomes a race between two models of society, one based on coercion and the other based on opportunity. This is why Kotkin compares Ukraine's future to South Korea's past. South Korea didn't win its war in 1953 by defeating its enemy outright. It won by building something better on its half of the peninsula, a functioning state. a thriving economy, a political system resilient enough to withstand pressure and attractive enough to inspire loyalty. And this is what he believes Ukraine can become, a democratic success story sitting on Russia's border, a living demonstration of what Moscow fears most, that people presented with a better system will choose it. For Kotkin, that's the real threat to authoritarian power, not armies, but examples. But there's a catch. Ukraine can't do this alone. It needs the United States and Europe, not just to send weapons, but to commit to rebuilding, investing, and guaranteeing that Ukraine can integrate into Western institutions without being held hostage by its neighbor. Exactly the way West Germany became part of a larger democratic architecture after World War II. Kotkin doesn't romanticize this outcome. He knows it's complicated, expensive, and politically divisive. But he also knows the alternative, a shattered buffer zone stuck between two worlds. And this is where Kotkin returns to something that's easy to miss. The United States isn't being asked to occupy another country or fight another endless war. It's being asked to help shape the conditions for a stable future in Europe. The same kind of long-term commitment that prevented World War III. From Kotkin's perspective, Ukraine is not a distraction from American interests, it's a reinforcement of them. If Ukraine succeeds, Russia becomes less threatening, Europe becomes more cohesive, and China loses a potential partner in undermining the Western order. If Ukraine collapses, the opposite happens. Kotkin's deeper point is that history is full of moments when the outcome seemed uncertain, and the choices made in those moments shaped entire centuries. He doesn't talk about this war as if it's frozen in the present. He sees the future radiating out from it. That's why he rejects the fatalistic idea that decline is inevitable or that democracies are too divided to act. He argues that democratic systems have something authoritarians fear: the ability to correct themselves. They can debate, fight, elect new leaders, and still move forward. A dictatorship has no such margin for error. Once it heads down the wrong path, it often accelerates instead of turning back. The story isn't finished. The actors aren't fixed. The alliances aren't static. What happens next depends on decisions that haven't been made yet about production, diplomacy, reconstruction, and political will. In Kotkin's view, the future isn't something that hits us. It's something shaped by the systems we choose to strengthen or let decay. As Kotkin widens the lens one last time, he confronts a question that feels almost too big to answer. Is the 21st century still America's century? For a lot of people, especially after years of political division, economic anxiety, and global crises, the instinctive answer is no. They look at rising authoritarian powers and assume the US is slipping. But Kotkin rejects that narrative. He doesn't deny America's problems. He highlights them constantly, but he insists that the country still holds advantages that no rival can replicate. And the most important one isn't money or military hardware. It's the ability to correct itself. In democracies, failure isn't final. Mistakes can be challenged. Institutions can be reformed. Leaders can be replaced. Authoritarian systems don't have that kind of safety valve. When they get something wrong, they double down. And when they double down, the consequences compound. This is why Kotkin pushes back when Henry Kissinger laments that our era lacks statesmen with strategic depth. Kotkin argues the problem isn't the people, it's the environment they're living in. We're flooded with information, but starved of context. And that's why he circles back to a principle he repeats often: history is a sensibility which says the present is not going to last, the present is going to change. It's a reminder that everything power, stability, alliances is temporary unless maintained. It's learning to anticipate change and to understand that today's reality is not guaranteed tomorrow. If you take that idea seriously, the events in Ukraine stop looking like an isolated tragedy and start looking like a hinge, a moment when choices made by flawed actors in one region reshaped the strategic terrain of another. Russia's invasion wasn't just a military disaster. It was a diplomatic catastrophe that pushed Europe closer to the United States than at any time since the Cold War. China's instinctive support for Moscow wasn't just symbolic. It shattered the ambiguity that Beijing had relied on to keep Europe comfortable. And America's response, imperfect, political, messy, still ended up reinforcing a coalition that now sees the world with clearer eyes. Kotkin's final caution is that none of this guarantees success. The United States can still undermine itself through infighting, negligence, or short-sightedness. Europe can slide back into complacency. Ukraine can be abandoned before its institutions stabilize. China can miscalculate. Russia can lash out. But nothing in this story is predetermined, and that's exactly his point. Decline is a choice, not a destiny. When you zoom out far enough, the entire conflict becomes a study in how modern power actually works. It's not about acquiring more land or showing more force. It's about shaping the environment in which nations operate, who they trade with, who they trust, who they depend on, who they fear becoming isolated from. Wars today don't just redraw borders, they redraw assumptions. And the war in Ukraine redrew one of the biggest, that Europe could drift between the gravitational pulls of America and China without choosing. Kotkin believes the world is entering a phase where mistakes matter more, where decisions echo longer, and where clarity about alliances, values, and interests will define who leads and who follows. And in this moment of uncertainty, the US still has the thing that all great powers eventually need: partners who want it to succeed. That's why Kotkin's initial sentence, the one that sounded so jarring, makes sense once you trace the consequences outward. He wasn't praising a war. He was describing the shock that forced democracies to look up, reassess their assumptions, and act before the world moved without them. If the 21st century does remain America's century, it won't be because the US imposed its will. It will be because the world, through tragedy, fear, and hard lessons, chose to realign around it.